Chapter 763 Fighting a Protector, 4. Listening to the familiar, yet unfamiliar voice, my mind blanked for a moment. When I turned my head, it blanked completely. A figure sat cross-legged next to me. How? I opened my mouth to speak, but the words died in my throat when I noticed the missing chains on his body. His expressionless face gave nothing away, and I couldn't read any emotions in it. I felt a shock wave through me at the realization of what this could mean. What is going on? Kevin's dead. His voice carried a sense of indifference to it. I noticed that he blinked his eyes a few times while he was staring off into the distance. That was when I also turned my head and saw Waylon standing in the distance. My heart sank to the lowest depths imaginable. So that was the case. He seemed to have understood something. The extent. I didn't know, but that didn't matter. When I stared at him and remembered his goal, I moved away from him. What are you doing? It seemed as though my actions had taken him by surprise, but I didn't give a damn as I slowly stood up. I tried to, but... Thump. The moment I attempted to, I immediately collapsed to the ground. There, I became aware that the majority of my bones were broken, and that many of my muscles had also been torn. What do you think you're doing? You're in no state to be moving at the moment. I warily looked at him and took a deep breath. Do you really think I'd welcome you with open arms or something? Especially when I know exactly what you want to achieve. He was me, yet at the same time he wasn't. While it did look like he was on my side, he wasn't. Our interests were drastically different, and I knew he was as much of a threat as Waylon, if not more. He seemed to have realized my thoughts, as not long after he nodded his head. Understandable. As he slowly stood up while pressing his hands against the ground, I retreated a few meters in the opposite direction, dragging my body with the little strength I had in my hands. He might be free, but he can't harm me yet. The only way he could harm me was by possessing my body and attempting suicide from there. The fact that he had not yet done so indicated that he was not yet a threat to me. At least. I hoped that was the case. What are you trying to do? I asked him while turning my head to look at the distance. It was faint, but I could feel Waylon approaching my direction. Damn it. I tightened my teeth. I did everything in my power to kill him, but I was ultimately unsuccessful. Rather, it did not appear that I was even close to killing him. Was this the limit of my current powers? Despite everything that Kevin did. It was frustrating. You don't need to be wary. I almost scoffed at his words. With everything that he had done to me, the words he said to me, did he really think I'd actually not be wary of him? His cold and empathetic gaze fell on me. If I really wanted to do something to you at the moment, I'd have already done it by now. I frowned at his words, but at the same time, musing over them, I realized that what he said made sense. If he really did want to do something to me, with the chains gone, it wouldn't be that hard. Rather, the fact that he was talking to me at the moment suggested that he had something to talk about. While my body was still tense, I did lower my guard a little. I'll hear you out. He cocked his head. Hear me out. I raised my brow. Did you appear because you wanted to say something to me? No. He shook his head, confusing me. Then what are you here for? Simple, really. He raised his head to look into the distance. I followed his gaze, and it was there that I noticed he was looking in Waylon's direction. You want to, huh? When I lowered my head to look at him again, I was shocked to see that he was gone. Before I could even figure out where he was, I heard a quiet voice coming from right next to me. It's as you think. I felt a palm press against my shoulder, and I started to panic. What do you think you're doing? But before I even had a chance to resist, I heard his voice inside my head, and my vision turned black. Lend me our body. This. Waylon couldn't believe his injuries were not healing as quickly as he expected them to. In fact, they didn't seem to be healing at all. The realization filled him with anger, and he clenched his teeth tightly. This is impossible. He placed his hand over the area where his other arm used to be, feeling the rage build up from deep within his body. The pain was unbearable, and it only added fuel to the fire of his already intense emotions. I should have killed him back then. Waylon thought in anger. He regretted not taking care of the problem when he first met him. Back then, he was still so weak and could have killed him with a single snap of his fingers. But his main goal was Douglas, so he had to bide his time. On many occasions, he debated whether to kill him or not, but just when he made up his mind, he noticed a certain mark on his body and gave up all ideas. Instead, he quickly befriended him and tried to help him in all the ways he could possibly think of. Since he was marked, it meant that he was an important person. But who would have thought that the one who put the mark on him was the same person who had betrayed them? That traitor. Waylon growled, his teeth clenched in anger. Thinking about the traitor only fueled his anger even further. He had screwed everything they had been working for, and he was the reason why all of this was happening. If not for him, none of this would have happened. I need to kill him. Waylon muttered through gritted teeth. As he gave up on his arm which was not healing, he shifted his focus in the direction of where he had last seen Ren. By his estimates, Ren should be on the verge of dying. With a wave of his hand, the space in front of him shattered, and he appeared above a certain area. When he looked down, his brows furrowed in confusion. Ren seemed to be in much better shape than he had originally anticipated. Contrary to his expectations, his injuries had healed, and he seemed to be stronger than ever. What happened to him? Waylon wondered aloud, unable to understand how he was still doing so well. The most noticeable change, however, was the coloration of his eyes and hair. They were gray and white, respectively. Observing him from above, he also noticed his gaze and demeanor were completely different than before. Taking one last deep look at him, he no longer paid any mind to the changes anymore. Such a change in his eyes and hair wasn't something he particularly felt threatened by. The only thing that made him wary was the calmness in his gaze. It felt a little unsettling, but Waylon quickly dispelled such a feeling away. He was a protector, a being chosen by the records to uphold the balance of the universe. Why would he feel threatened by such a small existence? But then, a voice reached his mind, interrupting his thoughts. You're finally here. Ren's voice echoed in his mind. When Waylon raised his head up, he saw Ren standing right before him. His dull gray eyes directly locked onto him, regarding his entire existence in the same manner in which he previously looked at him. Waylon was still able to maintain his calm as he took his time to observe the man before him. You were waiting for me? Waylon asked, surprised. I was. Ren replied calmly. The calmness in his voice unsettled Waylon even further. He frowned and spoke. I already know that the only reason you're still standing is because of the potions you've been taking. However, don't think dash. Quiet. Ren interrupted him coldly. Waylon felt his mouth shut completely, and golden runes clamped themselves on his cheek and mouth. Ren observed him with interest. What interesting power. He lowered his head to gaze at his hand. A white, black, and green glow surfaced within his body and his brows furrowed. What mess! He remarked as he continued to stare at the powers that were circling around him. When he finally tore his gaze away from them, he looked at Waylon in a relaxed manner. Still. Waylon broke free of the shackles that were restraining him and moved very far away from him. He had to move quite a distance, but he was still able to hear his final words. It should be about enough. Chapter 764 Fighting a Protector, 5. Ren's body, it was a complete mess. There were far too many distinct powers, and the demonic laws and Akashic laws were exhibiting signs of repulsion toward one another. Ren was unfamiliar, yet familiar, with the Akashic laws. They were the laws that had been binding at this body for the past few centuries. He never wielded them before, but the moment he used them, it felt as though it was second nature to him. Not to mention the golden runes and words that were circling around his body. With just one look, it seemed as though he could decipher their meaning with just a look, and as he stared at his hands, which were coated in a white substance, he turned his attention back toward Waylon and pressed his palm forward. Boom! Futile. Waylon dislodged the palm with a swift whack, causing it to splinter and fly off into the horizon. Following that, he launched a counterattack by pressing his own palm down. A gigantic hand suddenly materialized above Ren's head and made an attempt to squish him from on high. Ren took a measured look at the situation before removing his sword from its sheath. He merely pressed the tip of his sword up, and the palm came to rest directly above him. Woong! From the intersection of the two forces, where they met in the middle, a tremendous wind erupted. It was powerful enough to push the two back a few meters in response. Waylon's eyes shone. He's different from before. Waylon thought, regaining his footing. The degree of control over the power that he displayed wasn't the same as the one he showed before. There was something completely different about him for some unexplained reason, and the manner in which he carried himself was even more unsettling. Are you really the same, Ren? The surprised Waylon asked. The more he examined him, the more convinced he became that there was something peculiar about him. It appeared as though he was going up against a completely different entity than before. But how was that possible? You give off a different feeling from before. Waylon squinted his eyes. I'm not sure what it is, but it now explains to me why you were so confident a little earlier. Was this power of yours what gave you the confidence to challenge me? Swoosh! A splintering occurred in the space around Ren, and an invisible shot toward his leg. Ren, who was taken aback by the sudden attack, attempted to evade it but was just a fraction of a second too late. Spurt! The blow went all the way through his leg, causing a massive amount of bleeding. Staring at his leg, Ren showed no change in expression. I couldn't even feel it. Darkness seeped into Ren's eyes, and the demonic energy that had been building up inside of his body suddenly erupted, covering his entire leg and erupting from his body in the form of scales that covered the wound completely. Once the wound was covered, he flapped his wings once and appeared right before Waylon. He made a single thrust with his sword. Better. Waylon was able to avoid the slashing attack. He then countered with a blow from his own fist, which caused the air around it to twist and turn like a whirlwind. Dangerous. Ren thought at the sight of the approaching fist. The power that was hidden behind that punch was not something that he could take lightly at any point. He was able to sense that Waylon had packed a lot of power into that seemingly simple fist aimed directly at his chest. He crossed his arms in front of his chest and... boom! A deafening roar filled the area as though an explosion had occurred. As a result of the impact, Ren rolled away like a ball and flew for several hundred meters in the air. As the initial target of the attack, Ren's crossed wrists were severely trembling as a result of the blow. He had done this to prevent the punch from reaching his main body, and while he did indeed succeed, it came with a lot of pain. Feeling the pain in his body, his eyes turned somewhat serious. He's not that much weaker than Jezebeth. He had never faced off against a protector before, and he didn't know very much about them at all. At this point, all he was doing was testing the waters with them. In a way, since he knew so little about them, he deemed the current fight just as troublesome as the ones he had with Jezebeth in the past. In any case, Waylon's fist did not appear to be a typical fist to him, based on what he was able to observe. It was endowed with the laws, and his control and influence over them were astounding, to say the least. It had been a very long time since Ren had perceived a threat from a person or entity that was not the Demon King. Crack! Crack! His shattered wrist began to mend as a shadowy glow began to form around his entire body. Even though Ren's body was a chaotic mess because of all of the powers that his body possessed, if one had proper control over the powers within it, they'd be an unstoppable force. It took his wrist no more than a couple of seconds to return to its normal state, but by the time it did, Waylon had already moved ahead of him. Healed enough. Waylon aimed his kick at his neck. During the kick, the wind seemed to be tearing itself apart, and it left a trail of white in its wake. After Ren tapped his sword, there was a faint clicking sound that emanated from it. Click. Waylon's body twisted just before Ren felt his sword make contact with it, as if he could sense Ren's intentions. Much to Ren's surprise, he felt his sword make contact with nothing. I missed. This was such an unfamiliar feeling, only Jezebeth had ever done this before. Before Ren even had a chance to respond, Waylon aimed a kick toward his stomach. Swoosh! Ren was able to avoid it by a narrow margin as his body similarly twisted and an opening appeared. He tried to capitalize on the opportunity to launch his own attack and counterattack. Reaching down with his hand, he tried to reach the hilt of his sword with his hand. At the same time, looking up, Ren's gaze fixed on Waylon's temple. That was his target. Bang! Waylon's foot redirected itself into the air and kicked down. It was right at the moment when Ren's hand was about to press the hilt of the sword, and after the kick hit his hand in just the right spot, Ren's hand redirected itself away from the sword. Waylon disappeared from Ren's view shortly after that and reappeared a couple of meters away. He then made a fist with his free hand and extended it in front of him. Why-ying! At that moment, the area around Ren began to warp. A gigantic projection of a hand materialized right beneath where he was standing, and it gripped him in the middle of its palm. The projection began to gradually contract with him in the center as golden runes adhered to his legs, pinning him to the spot and securing him there. At the same time he did that, he appeared right beneath Ren and punched him out. Whatever you've done, the results are the same. You are far too weak to fight against a protector. Waylon had the distinct impression that victory was within his reach. About a quarter of the laws he had left in his body was consumed by these series of attacks he had just performed, and he was confident that not even the Demon King would be able to defend against such an attack without taking damage, let alone someone who wasn't even close to his level. I've heard that line many times before. Contrary to his belief, Ren didn't seem to be in any distress after being subjected to the two attacks. He stared at his hand, where a white glow formed and golden runes floated out. As the runes moved in his hand in a fluid manner, he redirected his gaze toward his sword. He slowly unsheathed it. Pack! 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 The moment he did so, the sword shattered into thousands of fragments, which then formed a ring around him and began to revolve around him. The white glow in his hand moved towards the fragments, and then they all shot out away from him. Bang! 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 The fragments shattered through the air and slammed into the two opposing forces that were moving toward Ren. The moment that the two forces came into contact with one another, the air would twist and the projection would turn fainter. The process was reasonably quick, and in a matter of seconds, the hand that was closing in on Ren from beneath vanished entirely. The same could be said for the fist as it similarly vanished. All that came to Ren was a strong wind that blew his hair up. Come back. The shattered pieces suddenly flew in his direction and reassembled themselves onto his sword, restoring it to its original complete state. Pack! 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 This is... Waylon's expression turned grim at the sight of his two attacks getting blocked. He had not expected such an outcome. Especially since he had gone quite seriously in that attack. Bang! The two clashed once more. Waylon's fist met Ren's sword, and the two bounced back. The more Waylon fought, the more he felt his pride hurt. Looking at Ren, his mouth parted open. You're definitely not Ren. He wasn't exactly sure of it before, but he was sure of it now. The man that was standing before him was a completely different entity from the Ren that he knew. That's where you're wrong. Ren shook his head and fixed his gaze on Waylon as he did so. After opening his mouth, his icy words rained down on the area around them. I am indeed Ren. Chapter 765 Fighting a Protector, 6. You're Ren. Wayland's eyes appeared to be squinting. He examined Ren very carefully from top to bottom, and he had doubts about what he was saying. Even though he did look like Ren, the energy he was putting off was completely different, not to mention the fact that he appeared to be significantly stronger than he was before. There was definitely something off about him. He just couldn't quite place his finger on it. I find that hard to believe. That's not something that I care about. In response to Wayland's display of skepticism, Ren did not show any interest in defending himself. In fact, he had no real interest in anything. He just wanted to get this done with already. What an annoying response. The anger that was building up on Wayland's face manifested itself in the form of a rigid expression, and he rushed over to Ren. To protect himself, Ren quickly drew his sword from its sheath. At the same time, he directed the laws toward the body of the sword, covering it with them. Only that. The moment Wayland's hand came into contact with the sword, the laws shattered. This? Wayland smiled at it. Did you think you'd be able to control the laws better than me? Someone who's wielded them for centuries. Ren's brows furrowed slightly. This was proving to be more troublesome than he had anticipated. Bang! Ren's body flew several meters back. When his body stabilized, Wayland appeared right behind him and pushed his only hand toward Ren's back. The space where his hand traveled fractured into several pieces. Whatever change you've gone through, it's far from enough. As soon as the palm made contact with Ren's back, his body shot off into the distance once more. While Ren's body was flailing about like a rag doll, there was no discernible expression on his face. However, there was noticeable blood streaking down the side of his mouth. Predictable. While in midair, Ren suddenly twisted his body and slashed behind him. Clank! Clank! Wayland's body appeared as he blocked the attack, and Ren finally stabilized himself. Extending his finger forward, the space around Wayland cracked apart, and golden streaks of tangible sword energy pierced at him like a porcupine. They came at him in all directions and at speeds that left one unable to react. Shio! 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 However, just as they were about to pierce his body, they came to an abrupt halt. Wayland broke into a grin as he took a closer look at the sword energies that surrounded him. How int! His face froze into a stone-like expression as his head shot up, and he looked at Ren. Woong! At this precise instant, a powerful ripple spread across the area they were in, shattering the space around them into a number of separate fragments. The space had deteriorated to such an extent that one could actually make out Wayland's office behind it. Crack. As quickly as it could, the space made several attempts to fix itself, but as soon as the large sword appeared above Ren's head, it was unable to do anything other than continue to shatter and rebuild itself. It's that move again. Wayland immediately recognized the move as his eyes moved toward the hand that was no longer on his body. His internal laws surged to the surface in the form of golden runes, and a massive shield materialized in front of him. At the same time, Ren's cold gaze paused on Wayland. It's been a while since I've fought someone of this level. It seems like I'm still a bit rusty. The massive sword that was behind him continued to take shape and grow both more distinct and more substantial with each passing second. Tch. Ren drew his primary sword from its sheath as the second sword began to materialize behind him. Pack! 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 The sword shattered into thousands of pieces, all of which became completely detached from one another as they rose up a few meters from each other. The blade that Ren held in his hand grew in size as a thin layer of white film connected the shards of the broken sword from piece to piece, creating a larger sword. While staring at the white film covering his main sword, a sudden thought crossed Ren's mind. It's risky. If all goes bad, I might die. Those thoughts lasted seconds, and he put them into action. Sounds good. So what if he died? Wasn't that his goal to begin with? The outer white layer of the sword was obscured by a dark film that emerged from within Ren's body and covered it. It was demonic energy. Within minutes of making its appearance, the white film began to wiggle, and a destructive power that was on par with the enormous sword in the background began to spread. Impossible. Waylon watched everything that was taking place with a horrified expression on his face. The process of building up took only a few seconds in total. His original strategy was to defend the attack and then launch a counterattack shortly after when he was exhausted. However, he immediately abandoned that notion. I can't wait for him to attack. It was an obvious decision. His body suddenly materialized in front of Ren, and the barrier that had been forming in front of him vanished. His eyes gave off a dazzling white light. As he arched his back, he did not withhold anything. He clenched his fist tightly, gathered all the strength he could muster, and then punched out. Don't push your luck. Crack. Crack. Everything shattered. As soon as he released his grip on his fist, the space around him began to shatter, and the background of his office became more distinct. The paintings and pictures that were hung on the wall began to tremble, even if only very slightly, and the entire office began to shake. Wong! The fist was aimed directly at Ren's face, and held nothing back. The sword behind him had only formed halfway, and he seemed to still be struggling to control his main sword, which was alternating between white and black. Taking note of this, Waylon held his breath in anticipation, but... Right, I knew this would happen. Ren's eyes, which had been fixated on the sword, moved away from it as he changed his focus. At that precise moment, the area around him began to warp, and the vacant gray pupils in his eyes concentrated on the punch that was drawing near. His expression remained unchanged despite the fact that the fist was drawing closer to his face. Move. Just one word in total. It was only one word, but as soon as he muttered it, golden runes appeared from the area around the fist and clamped onto it like a rope that pulled to the left, and the trajectory of the punch altered if ever so slightly. When Waylon saw this, his eyes widened, and just as he was about to take control of the laws, he felt something touch his forehead, and when he looked up he saw two dull gray pupils staring back at him. All of a sudden, everything came to a sudden standstill. How? With his finger placed right on Waylon's forehead, a ripple spread from the point of contact, which expanded all throughout the pocket space. You fell for it. The sword behind him disappeared, and so did the two energies around it. How? It was so fast that Waylon wasn't even able to react. And in that brief moment, time seemed to have stopped. Locking his eyes against the emotionless-looking Ren, Waylon watched as Ren's mouth parted open, and he muttered. Boom! Boom! Waylon's body vanished from view and then re-emerged far off in the distance, slamming into one of the buildings. Bang! Whack! He let out a pained groan. The moment he slammed into the buildings in the distance, the surrounding area began to flicker, and the background of the office became increasingly distinct. Fool! Ren murmured as he materialized directly in front of Waylon, who was pinned up against the wall of the building. Both his hair and the Akashic laws on his body were a mess, and his face was extremely pale. On the other hand, while Ren was also not in the most optimal of shapes, his condition was a lot better. CK. 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 Stepping onto the ground, Ren's wings and the scales that covered his body began to retract in unison. He shrank to human size, regaining his human appearance in the process. He casually walked toward Waylon, who weakly raised his head. Why, you can't do this. Ren stopped in front of him and looked down at him with his eyes. The gaze felt oddly familiar to Waylon, who suddenly recalled. It was the same gaze at which he looked at Ren just before their fight started, and it was there that Waylon understood something. In his eyes, he was insignificant. Why can't I do this? The calmness in his voice made Waylon's face grow pale. If you kill me, Jezebeth will come. I am the last barrier that is preventing him to come. Oh. Ren had a sudden understanding, and his hand pressed against Waylon's face. Original last words. Crunch. His hand squeezed, and Waylon's face crushed under his hand. Even though there was a damp feeling all over his hand, Ren didn't appear to be bothered by it as he observed something peculiar. Is this how it is? As soon as he let go of Waylon's body, the scenery around him began to crumble, and he was suddenly back in the office. Ren didn't care in the least bit, as his eyes were focused on Waylon's body. There was a yellow orb levitating over his body, and he felt a familiar feeling coming from it. He, of course, knew what the orb was. He had seen it, and his eyes squinted. What's done is done. He took his eyes away from it and turned his head away. His gaze settled over a sizable mirror by the side of the office. He calmly walked toward the mirror and looked at himself. It had been a while since he'd last seen himself, and he'd almost forgotten that his hair and eyes were different from how they were back then. Katich. He was unaware of the amount of time that had passed since he stood in front of the mirror. However, as he maintained his focus on the mirror, he suddenly noticed that both of his hands were resting on his throat. Squeezing. Katich. The hold became increasingly tighter with each passing second, and even though he did not alter his expression in any way, he could clearly see the color fading away from his face. He felt tempted. Tempted to end it all at this moment. This was his chance to finally accomplish his long-awaited wish. He was just one squeeze away, but not yet. He let go of his throat. With his gaze still fixed on the mirror, he repeated. Not yet. Chapter 766 War in Idoania, 1. Quack. Awk. It's futile. Jezebeth beamed as he gazed at the protector, who was in his grasp. The look of utter disbelief and despair on their faces brought nothing more than joy to Jezebeth, who wanted to savor the moment for as long as possible. There was once upon a time when he looked at them with the same gaze. They reminded him of his past self. Shit. He suddenly became aware of a powerful force moving in his direction from the right. Jezebeth didn't even bother to look at the attack and instead simply raised his hand in response to it. Clank. The blade came to a stop on Jezebeth's hand, and dark blood dripped from his palm. Even though it hurt a little, Jezebeth didn't pay the slightest bit of attention to the discomfort. He just wanted to take in their expressions. He couldn't get enough of them. Come now. Don't struggle anymore when the results are already set in stone. He secured his grip on the sword and pulled it with his hand. Awk. As the second protector fell forward, he reached out with his free hand and grabbed hold of her neck, firmly securing it in his hand. Ah. Now, this is a sight I would die for. 2 protectors, and they were both in his grasp. Rumble. Just as he was savoring the view, the space around him began to warp, and 4 massive fissures appeared. The massive sun that was facing him shrank, and within the cracks that were created, 4 figures materialized. There were 2 orcs and 2 dwarves in the group. Jezebeth experienced a tremendous amount of pressure almost immediately after they made their appearance. Greater than what the 2 protectors he was holding in his hand had previously given him, and almost caused him to lose his hold on them. Demon King. The space filled with the sound of a voice that was both ancient and ethereal. It belonged to one of the Orson protectors. The sight of him made Jezebeth smile even more, and his head lowered. Ah, if it isn't the protector of the seat of patience. Ignoring Jezebeth's words, the protector's icy gaze passed over Jezebeth before pausing on the 2 protectors that he was holding in his grasp. His brows were drawn together, and the tone of his voice conveyed obvious dissatisfaction. Let them go. Oh. As the eyes of the 2 protectors in his hand changed, Jezebeth's expression shifted to one of obvious dissatisfaction. The despair and horror that were previously clouding their faces were gone. What pity! He nodded his head. Okay. Crack. Crack. He exerted pressure with his hands, and the bodies of the two protectors vanished from within his grasp as they disintegrated into yellow particles that floated in the space in front of him, leaving two yellow orbs in their place. Come. The two yellow orbs materialized in his hand as he extended his thin finger, and he observed them in a composed manner. I wonder what this does. He had always been curious about it, but no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't figure out what it was that they did. He attempted to absorb them, but they were not something that he could absorb, which was unfortunate given that the power that was concealed within them was something that could have helped him become more powerful. Oh, well. I might as well give this to my subordinates. Even though he was unable to absorb them, that did not mean they were useless to him. With the faint golden runes surrounding the orbs, if one was capable enough and studied them properly, they'd be able to come to a subtle understanding of the laws. If his subordinates managed to learn a bit about the laws, then. But is 2 enough? There were 7 clans and only 2 orbs, clearly, there weren't enough yet. He lifted his head and looked up at the other protectors, whose expressions had become distorted after the deaths of the previous 2 protectors. The atmosphere began to shift, and as a result, the skin on their bodies began to peel off. A tidal wave of power gushed forth from each of their bodies, and the space started to fluctuate wildly. You'll pay for that. Each one of them muttered in unison. Their voices in sync with one another. Oh. Jezebeth nodded disinterestedly. He'd heard it many times before. He shook his head and stared at the 4 protectors while he stuffed the 2 yellow orbs into his pocket. Come then. I need those yellow orbs of yours. Planet Idoania. This verdant paradise was the planet where the elite elven force had decided to settle in. It was a strategic point, strategically positioned to hold back the demons and Jezebeth from reaching planet Earth. The planet was blessed with lush forests, rolling hills, and crystalline rivers that sparkled in the sunlight. It was a breathtaking sight, a world that could make even the most stoic of individuals stop in awe. The sky was a deep shade of blue, without a single cloud in sight, and the air was perfumed with the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. It was an idyllic paradise, where the soft breeze carried the songs of the birds and the rustle of the leaves. But this paradise was not meant to last. Rumble. Rumble. The ground shook, and the sky dimmed. The refreshing scent of flowers faded, replaced by a repulsive, iron-like scent that slowly took over the entire planet. Dark substances splashed and stained the verdant grass as limbs followed suit. Whack! Eck! Agonized screams reverberated through the air, and the ground shattered at every instance. A full-fledged war had taken over the entirety of the planet. In the midst of this chaos, Angelica stood her ground. She was surrounded by 3 elven warriors, who seemed to be struggling to contain her. Her eyes glowed mysteriously, and her brows furrowed at the sight of a silver streak heading her way. Shio! Angelica quickly moved her head to avoid the arrow, and just in time, she caught a glimpse of the arrow. Demonic energy sprang forth from her body, and just as she was about to retaliate, she sensed multiple attacks coming her way from all sides. Tisk! She clicked her tongue and stopped whatever she was doing. She brought her hand forward, and a small barrier formed in front of her. It was of translucent color and rather thick. The arrows came, and like the sound of someone tapping on a glass, the barrier rippled. But that was it. Tick. 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 That's it. Angelica cast her gaze over the elven warriors who stared at her barrier with a dumbfounded look. She gave them a nonchalant look before waving her hand once. Hey wah whack! As if tranced, one of the elven warriors turned around and stabbed his comrade. Blood spurted out, and the atmosphere froze. The elf snapped out of it and gazed at the scene with shock. What just happened? He muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Poochie. An arrow pierced him through his chest before he could figure out what had happened. His face froze, and he stared at the arrow impaled on his body with a look filled with disbelief. His figure fell to the ground shortly after, and Angelica's gaze shifted toward the furthest elven warrior. Thump. In her eyes, he was the most troublesome one. How should I handle this? Her gaze landed on the other elf, and thinking for a moment, a smile crept up on her pretty features. Twirling her body toward the elven warrior in the distance, Angelica charmingly smiled. That smile, however, didn't last for long as it soon froze. She witnessed the elven warrior suddenly fall over from the tree branch they were standing on, and a head slowly rolled in her direction. Poochie. Shortly after, she heard a sound coming from behind her, and her expression froze over. When she turned around, a demon appeared in her vision. He had short black hair and green eyes. His face was rather charming, and with two large wings and scales all over his body, he gave off a rather imposing presence. What are you doing? Angelica couldn't help but feel a sense of disgust as she took in the demon's appearance. His messy hair, crooked smile, and lackadaisical demeanor seemed to rub her the wrong way. If anything, his nonchalant attitude seemed to irritate her even further, making her face frost over. Hey, there. What do you want? She snapped. The demon merely smiled, his expression friendly and almost innocent. But Angelica wasn't fooled. She could see the manipulative glint in his eyes, the way he seemed to be enjoying her discomfort. Nothing much, he said, shrugging his shoulders. I'm just lending you a hand. I don't need your help. Angelica replied, her voice dripping with venom. You can go and help yourself out. Now, Angelica. The demon chided. Is that any way to treat your future fiancé? Angelica's teeth ground together at his words. The very thought of being betrothed to this demon made her want to gag. She had come to the demon world to train, to become stronger, not to be tied down in some political marriage. It hasn't been decided yet. The demon's smile didn't falter. True, but the decision will be made shortly after this war. I hope you're prepared. I'm not. Angelica snorted, turning away from the demon. She had no interest in her family's politics nor in the matter of producing an heir. Whoop. As she flapped her wings and took to the air, she couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. She had come to the demon world with a purpose, to become stronger and hone her skills. And she had been making progress, she was certain of it. But now, with the looming threat of a political marriage hanging over her head, she couldn't help but feel as though she had been pulled back into the very world she had been trying to escape. Angelica gritted her teeth, feeling a surge of anger rising up within her. As she flew further away from the demon, her mind couldn't help but drift back to the past, to a time when things had been simpler. When she had been able to focus solely on her training and nothing else. It seemed like a lifetime ago, even though it had only been a few months. Sigh. Angelica sighed, knowing that she couldn't dwell on the past. She had to focus on the present and on the task at hand. She was still far from reaching the Duke rank, but she was making progress, slowly but surely. If only. She bit her lip, a sense of frustration building within her. If only she didn't have to deal with all this political nonsense, she could devote all of her time and energy to her training. Chapter 767 War in Idoania, 2. In the skies above Idoania. You don't seem to be worried about what's going on. A demon spoke. His attention was drawn to the 3 elven figures that were positioned directly in front of him. There were also 6 additional demons standing next to him. The figures that stood in the sky each possessed a distinctive trait that set them apart from one another. The source of this content is frobubble.cm. Despite the fact that they were doing nothing, their presence completely overpowered those below. They were something that only the Demon King could subdue. Their presence was unlike that of any other prince-ranked demon, and all it took was a simple look from them to send one cowering away. They were the 7 heads of the demon clans. Patriarch of the clan of Envy, Prince Murdoch. Patriarch of the clan of Wrath, Prince Konjak. Patriarch of the clan of Sloth, Prince Letvia. Patriarch of the clan of Pride, Prince Andrea. Patriarch of the clan of Greed, Prince Solbacon. Matriarch of the clan of Lust, Princess Lilith. Matriarch of the clan of Gluttony, Princess Adiphagia. Are you perhaps just confident in yourselves, or? Lifting his head up toward the sky, Prince Murdoch cracked a smile. Are you perhaps waiting for reinforcements to arrive? As he spoke, the air around the elven leaders became still, and you could see cracks appearing on their faces. The trio of elven figures included an elderly man with a long beard and a wooden staff, in addition to 2 younger elven figures. Both male and female, in separate instances. They gazed at the 7 demon heads with incomparable seriousness. You think that we're afraid of you? The elderly elven man spoke. He was the chief elder of the elves and his power was near the peak of SSS plus rank. Even so, as he faced the 7 leaders of the demon clans, he couldn't help but feel as though he was being suffocated. As though something was clamping at his throat and clenching tightly at his airways, preventing any air from passing through. The situation was the same for the 2 other elves who struggled to keep themselves composed. They were clearly not a match for them. They were not the only ones who grasped this concept. The 7 heads were well aware of this fact and gave off the impression that they were delighted with the present situation. You aren't afraid of us? Prince Murdoch spoke, his voice sounding like the whispers of a snake. The faces of the elven leaders changed the moment he spoke in such a tone, and a trace of fear flashed across their eyes. They were well aware of who he was. It was highly likely that he was the strongest of all the people present, and if there was a justification for why the clan of Envy was considered to be the strongest of all the demon clans, it was solely because of this one particular demon. A mere couple of words from him and the air around them distorted. His gaze fell on the chief elder, and his eyes were filled with ridicule. Your expression says otherwise, he said, extending his slender finger and pressing it against the air. Immediately, the air around them stilled, and the expressions of the 3 elven figures changed drastically. They felt as if a weight was pressing down on them, suffocating them. Shall we see the extent of your fear? Swoosh! A demon materialized right behind him just as he was about to press his hand against the air. Prince Murdoch stopped himself, and he looked at the demon that had just appeared. Is something the matter? He didn't look displeased by the sudden interruption. Yes. The demon replied, casting a glance at the 6 other heads and the elven heads in the distance before moving toward Prince Murdoch. As he got closer to him, he uttered something in a low whisper, which caused Prince Murdoch's brows to furrow. Pondering for a moment, Prince Murdoch relayed the information to the other heads via telepathy after casting a glance in their direction. Do as you fit. Prince Konjak, the head of the Pride clan, replied with a disinterested look. In contrast to Prince Murdoch, who was a rather handsome figure, he was a burly demon with sideburns. His hair was short, and he sported a single horn. Let the strategist handle the matter. It was a woman's voice, and it came straight from Princess Adiphagia, the head of the Gluttony clan. Her form was enormous, even more so than that of Prince Konjak, whose stature towered over those of the other characters, and her eyes, which were obscured by her puffed-up cheeks, were difficult to see. She was similarly displaying an expression of disinterest, and all she did was cast a glance at Prince Murdoch before continuing. This isn't a matter that needs our attention. Let the strategist handle the matter. He hasn't failed us so far, and His Majesty seems to put a lot of trust in him, so let him handle the matter. Is their opinion the same as what you are thinking? Prince Murdoch took a look at the heads next to him. He could feel their gaze on him, and he saw them nod at him, which caused his eyes to flash. I see. He nodded his head and returned his gaze toward the demon that had relayed the message. He was a prince-ranked demon, but he was no different than a bug in his eyes. You've heard them. Inform them and the strategist of the situation. He should be able to handle the situation. Understood. The demon displayed a humble bow while flapping his wings. His form quickly vanished from sight as it dissolved into the atmosphere and became indistinguishable from it. Despite his disappearance, Prince Murdoch was easily able to follow him with his gaze. Let the strategist handle the matter, huh? Before turning his attention back to the elven leaders, his eyes suddenly lit up with something that no one could identify. He then smiled at them and nodded his head as his gaze turned back to the elven leaders. Sorry for that, he said, a smirk playing on his lips. It looks like the reinforcements that you've been waiting for have finally arrived. Not a moment after his words faded, a crack formed in the distance. Crack. It was a magnificent building crafted from silks of a variety of vibrant colors and adorned with intricate gold embroidery. The spacious interior was softly illuminated by flickering torches, which cast a warm glow over the opulent furnishings that were contained within. We're currently pushing back the elves, so it's only right that we send more forces to clean them up before the reinforcements arrive. We won't have time. By the time they come, it'll already be too late to pull them back. The centerpiece of the tent was a hulking oak table that had been buffed to a mirror-like sheen and was surrounded by an assortment of elaborately carved chairs. On the table was a map of the region that had been spread out with various flags and symbols placed on it to indicate where the troops had been moving and where the strategic locations were. It was currently surrounded by several demons who seemed to be in deep discussion. I'm telling you, we should attack now and not waste time. Kill them before they get a chance to reverse things. That'll put us in a bad position. The walls of the tent were adorned with 7 different types of tapestries, and nearby were shelves that were stocked with leather-bound books and old scrolls. There was a cozy, woodsy aroma in the air, thanks to a small brazier in the far corner of the room. There was also a silver tray of refreshments sitting on a nearby side table, which featured a variety of unusual fruits, cheeses, and wines. A diminutive figure with black hair that reached the shoulders and a white mask sat at the far end of the table. The figure's sharp gaze moved quickly between the map and the various demons that were present in the room. It wasn't the white mask that was on his face that was most striking about him, rather, it was the deep green eyes that shone through behind the mask. None of those around him had the courage to look the man in the eyes. There was something off about them, and it seemed as though he could see right through them whenever his gaze was directed in their direction. The mood was tense, and the person seated at the end of the table drew the attention of everyone's gaze at various points throughout the conversation. He seemed to be deep in thought. The tent became increasingly silent as time passed, and eventually, the only sounds that could be heard were the scraping of quills on parchment and the wails of those that fell on the battlefield far off into the distance. The figure finally opened his mouth. So you're saying that reinforcements from the orcs and dwarves will be coming shortly? Yes, strategist. One of the demons that were present in the room responded. It turned out that he was the same prince-ranked demon who had communicated the news to the leaders of the clan, and he was actually one of the bodyguards who had been assigned to the strategist. The unexpected news caused the strategist's frown to deepen. In spite of this, he did not seem very anxious about the news. He sat down and calmly tapped his finger over the wooden table while at the same time carefully examining the map that was in front of him. Tap. 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 With each tap of his finger, a peculiar unease began to spread throughout the room. In the midst of the silence in the room, the tapping continued and gradually picked up speed, increasing the unease in the room. Tap, 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 tap. There's not enough information yet. When his finger finally came to a stop, something caught the strategist's attention, and his eyes flashed. Raising himself to his feet, he turned to look at the other demons before turning his gaze away from them. He then proceeded to move toward the opening of the tent, where he eventually stopped. Everyone followed his movements without saying a single word. When he opened the tent, allowing a small gap between the two pieces of fabric, bright sunlight entered the tent and illuminated it. At the same time, the strategist emerged from the tent and raised his head to look far into the horizon. Crack. His attention was immediately drawn to 5 enormous cracks in the sky that continued to grow larger with each passing second. The entirety of the battlefield came to a standstill, and the strategist proceeded to slowly place his hand over his mask and remove it, thereby revealing his flawlessly white skin and human face. His eyes narrowed as he stared into the distance at the fractures, and he mumbled something to himself. "They're slower than I predicted." Chapter 768 Changes on Earth, 1. Crack. Crack. It was a sight unlike any other. The sky, once a serene blue, was now cracking and breaking apart, revealing a jagged, gaping chasm that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. The edges of the crack glowed with an ethereal light as if searing heat emanated from the depths of the celestial rupture. "What's going on?" whispered someone in the crowd. "The sky. It's..." stuttered another. As the people stood there, frozen in awe, strange things began to happen. Rustle. Rustle. The crack pulsed and writhed, and one could hear a sound like the rustling of wings or the whispering of ghosts. And then, from the depths of the crack, something emerged, something huge and tangible, almost like a wave. Hey! Leon punched Ram, who was beside him. His gaze was currently drawn toward the crack in the sky. It was expanding by the second. "I'm not seeing this, right?" Ram shook his head, secretly taking a big gulp. There was something unsettling about the situation, and his lips trembled. You have any idea of what's happening?" "And no." Leon shook his head. "I think it's best if..." Just as he was about to finish his sentence, the crack exploded into bits, and the wave that formed above came crashing down from the sky. Crash! The wave was so powerful that it sent the people scattering in all directions. Accompanying the wave were screams of terror which resounded throughout. Pieces of the sky fell directly down to earth, and everyone fell into a state of panic. "Oh, shit!" Leon muttered, staring at the approaching wave. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. The wave was too fast and too large for him to avoid. By the time a second had gone by, the wave was already upon him, and he reflexively closed his eyes, thinking this would be his last. Whoosh! But just as he closed his eyes, he felt a passing breeze, and the mana inside of his body boiled. It was like a furnace had been lit inside him, and he could feel the power coursing through his veins. When he opened his eyes again, he was shocked to see that he was still alive. "I didn't die. What's going on?" He looked around him, checking to see if Ram was still fine. To his surprise, the screams of terror had completely died down, and when he looked around, he saw everyone with the same surprised expressions. "What happened?" Leon overheard Ram's absent-minded mutterings, and he turned his head toward him. He observed him closely but found that nothing was strange with him. The same went for Ram, who observed Leon just as closely. Just as the two were about to open their mouths, their eyes bulged simultaneously. It was as if they noticed it at the same time. The two of them quickly closed their eyes and felt the mana in the air. Moments after closing their eyes, they both opened them up again in shock. Staring at each other, their mouths turned agape. I'm not tripping, am I?" Ram's voice was barely above a whisper. "No. You're not tripping." Leon shook his head at Ram's words, his face filled with shock. Looking around and seeing the shocked expression on several other individuals, his mouth slowly opened. The mana in the air definitely became many times denser than before. Ugh! I was aware of everything that was going on the entire time. I was there, so I not only saw everything that took place, but I also saw the final moments. For a fleeting instant, the thought crossed my mind that this might be the end for me. There was nothing that stopped him from ending it all when I no longer had control over my body. During that moment, I really thought it'd be it for me. I thought that everything that I worked for would come crashing down at that moment, so. Why? Why did you not go through with it? I could not shake the question from my mind. I was extremely curious as to what had caused such a shift in attitude, given that I had previously attempted everything to change his mind. What was it that made him change his mind? Was it Kevin? Was he the one responsible for the sudden change? Ugh! I let out another groan as I felt the tips of my fingers and attempted to prop up the rest of my body from the ground. The entirety of my body hurt, and I was so stiff that I could hardly move. I knew that several of my bones had been fractured, and despite the fact that I had just consumed a potion, I also knew that I would still require some additional time to recuperate completely. Fuck. In spite of the excruciating pain, I was able to force myself toward the nearest wall and lean my back against it. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths in order to overcome the excruciating pain that was permeating my entire body. It was painful, but I was well versed with pain. Something of this magnitude did not bother me nearly as much as it would have quite some time ago when I was still at the lock. It isn't too bad. I started by looking around the room. It was in a state that was still acceptable. It looked like a few paintings and some papers had been knocked over, but other than that, there wasn't much damage. It just looked like a light breeze had come through the room, knocking the insignificant stuff down. Despite that. What is this? My attention was drawn to a particular yellow orb that floated in midair above the wooden floor. Although I was quite a distance away from it and found that I was unable to move closer to it, as I observed it, I got the impression that I was already familiar with it. Familiar golden runes and words floated around the orb, and I found myself unable to tear my gaze away from it. For some strange reason, it resonated with something within my body, and I stretched my hand toward it. Come. I uttered subconsciously as if I were in a trance. What was shocking, however, was the fact that the orb listened to my words. The orb responded to my command as if it were a sentient being and moved in my direction, drifting closer to me. Before coming to a halt, it hovered just a hair's breadth above the palm of my hand. A gentle pulse swept through the air, and I let out another breath. I didn't know when, but that breath was soon followed by another, and I was soon breathing heavily. This orb. There was something about the orb. I couldn't place what was causing it, but I noticed that my vision was becoming increasingly blurry, and I couldn't take my eyes off the runes and words that were surrounding the orb. I wasn't certain if I was hearing correctly or not at that moment, but I noticed gentle whispers lingering in the air, and I slowly brought my hand to a close. Swoosh! Immediately after my hand came to a close, another gentle golden pulse radiated through the air, sweeping through every corner of the room and spreading outwardly, reaching areas around the room I was in. This. At that precise moment, both my eyes suddenly became crystal clear, and a surge of power rushed through my body, filling every nook and cranny of it. The wounds that had formed inside of my body started to heal at an alarming rate, and before I knew it, I had fully recovered. In addition to that, I felt a rapid expansion of the laws that were within my body. If before the ratio between demonic energy and laws were uneven, now the laws were almost on equal terms with the demonic energy in terms of quantity. That. The two energies within my body started to compete with one another, so although it was a positive development, it also turned out to be quite a troublesome matter. To keep the two energies from clashing against one another, I had to concentrate extremely hard, and despite my best efforts, it was taking a significant toll on my body. Shit. I let out a curse through my clenched teeth. This presented quite a challenge, but as if that weren't enough, all of a sudden, I became aware of a distinct cracking sound emanating from further away, and I cocked my head in that direction. It's starting. The sight that appeared before me was beyond anything I could have possibly imagined. Despite this, rather than being shocked, I was more surprised by what I saw. I had a premonition that the moment I killed Waylon, something similar to this was going to take place. I made the decision not to work with him due to this factor as well. Before we turned against each other, the two of us could have easily used each other to defeat Jezebeth. The fact that this was taking place right now was the reason why I did not choose to go with such an option. Swoosh! The sky began to tear apart, and I felt a lingering breeze brush past my body. It invigorated each and every part of my body, and I could feel the mana within my body beginning to boil. Even though it wasn't happening very quickly, the mana that was contained within me began to grow and become more fluid. This is... I smiled at the feeling. It was exactly as I thought. Good. Clank. Dad, what's going, What are you doing on the ground? Where's my dad? Right at that moment, the door flung open, and in walked Emma. It wasn't until she saw that I was the only one in the room that her panic subsided, and she stopped looking around the room. When I felt her gaze on me, I opened my mouth to respond, but I found that I was unable to say anything. I gave it one more shot, this time taking a deep breath to calm myself down, but I got the same result. There was something stopping me from speaking. What's wrong with you? Emma asked, noticing the abnormality in me. Before I met her gaze, I forced a mouthful of saliva down my throat. I bit the inside of my lower lip and then cast my eyes downward before closing them. This is going to be troublesome. He went out to check out the situation.